Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. My name is James McGrindles, and I'm the head of public programs at the Bullock Museum. With all that's going on in the world today, mental health has become an issue that's a key concern for the nation. So, with that in mind, our discussion today is going to focus on the history of mental health and its development in Texas. We'll hear about the dramatic progress made in mental health during the mid 20th century, from reform of scandal ridden hospitals and institutions to the emergence of community mental health services to provide some context for where we stand on the issue today. I'm lucky to be joined by Dr. William Bush for this discussion. Dr. Bush is a professor of history and chair of the Department of Communication, History, and Philosophy at Texas A&M University, San Antonio. He's the author of a couple of books, including Circuit Writers for Mental Health, the Hogg Foundation in 20th Century Texas. Dr. Bush, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get into the history here, could you tell us a little bit about what inspired you to research and write on this topic?
Sure. There's really a couple of major reasons. One is just the topic is perpetually important in our public discourse. We've made lots of strides, as I discovered in working on this project, in identifying, treating, and supporting people with mental illness. But we obviously still have much work to do because it constantly is sort of flaring up in the news in various ways. Right now, we're talking about the trauma associated with the COVID-19 pandemic and with the police violence incidents going on in our society. We've in the recent past, mental health and mental illness have come up in the context of mass shootings, of the trauma associated with military service, with the overuse of the criminal justice system to provide mental health treatment. So it's sort of constantly coming up in the news. So that's one reason, it's just so relevant. And at the same time, a second reason, and maybe a little more specific to me, is that it relates to my research interests. And I research the history of children and childhood and juvenile justice. And that's how I kind of came across the topic in working on my first book on the history of race and juvenile justice in Texas. In the early 20th century, the juvenile justice system was getting its start, and the mental health movement was also kind of getting its start, both in Texas and in the nation. And that kind of drew me to the subject. I encountered it in the archives. I actually used the Hogg Foundation's archives in my first book project. So I already had some familiarity with the subject.
Well, that's great. Yeah, it's definitely an important topic. And like you said, it's in the news constantly. So in your book, you trace the changes in mental health in Texas from roughly 1940 to 1980-ish. Broadly speaking, can you describe for us the state of mental health in the early part of this time frame and what brought about the changes?
Sure. I mean, at the beginning of this time frame, so in the early 1940s, the average person in Texas, as well as in other parts of the United States, probably would not have been able to access mental health services outside of a hospital setting very easily. In addition, they wouldn't have really even known what the concept was, right? It wasn't something that people talked about. In fact, if anything, mental illness was sort of something you didn't talk about in polite society. Some families would actually have children institutionalized out of a sort of concern for public embarrassment. So there was a taboo and a lot of really ignorance kind of surrounding it. In Texas, the state operated a sort of a set of dispersed mental hospitals that were very prison-like and really had poor conditions around the state. The oldest one being the Austin State Hospital there in North Austin, which opened in 1861 as the Texas State Lunatic Asylum. And that name suggests another sort of feature of the early part of this period, which was the very language that we used to talk about mental health and mental illness. Right? It was very stigmatizing, right? Insane, lunatic, mad. Even experts, psychiatrists and psychologists in the early part of this period would talk about curable and incurable insane people, right? So, you know, that was sort of the setting at the beginning. All of that has changed and I identify that 40-year period between about 1940 and 1980. Obviously, we could certainly go forward or backward in either direction to talk about that change. And so there's really been a massive multi-pronged educational campaign to educate the public about mental health and mental illness, and to provide those services outside of a mental hospital. At the beginning of this period, there were no academic programs to train people at various levels of professionalization to work with mental health and mental illness, especially in Texas. So a lot of people would have to leave the state to get the training, and then, to get paid appropriately to provide the services. That was also a problem in Texas. Today, many public and private organizations and society offer formal mental health services. So it's not just clinics, it's not just group homes, the sort of settings that we're all probably familiar with that are community-based. Public schools, police departments, various government agencies, even a lot of private employers have mental health awareness programs for their employees. So you don't have to be an expert or a specialist to have some passing familiarity with mental health concepts. So a lot of things have changed. Some of the major reasons for that change, the mental health movement emerges in the first decade of the 20th century. And many of the leading figures in that movement were people that today we would call survivors, right? They were patients, former patients of mental hospitals. A guy named Clifford Beers in Massachusetts was a former patient in a mental hospital, and he was one of the founders of the National Committee for Mental Hygiene, which advocated for non-institutional treatment of people with mental illness and for something they call positive mental health. In Texas, Ima Hogg of the Hogg family, Miss Ima, as she was known to her friends and admirers, was herself a former patient, although she had not been institutionalized. She experienced a series of traumas, deaths in the family, and she had to leave the state to get treatment because it just wasn't available, even though somebody very wealthy. And so while she was in the Northeast seeking treatment, she met people who were part of the mental health movement, and she came back to Texas determined to spread that message around Texas. Another major reason was World War II at the beginning of this period in the 1940s. The experience of World War II profoundly advanced the cause of non-institutional community-based mental health. Army psychiatrists and psychologists developed treatment protocols outside of hospital settings for soldiers so that they could rotate back onto the battlefield even if they had experienced trauma. After the war ended, popular culture began portraying hospitals as these sort of terrible places. Think of a film like The Snake Pit, and portraying people with mental illness, especially military veterans, very sympathetically. The Oscar for Best Picture in 1946 went to a film called The Best Years of Our Lives, which profiled 3 military veterans and the traumas that they were experiencing trying to readjust to civilian life. And then lastly, the federal government began investing significantly in community-based mental health services in the late 1940s with the creation of the National Institute for Mental Health. So those are some reasons for the change and a sense of kind of the landscape at the beginning of this period and some of the steps that began to happen to change it.
That's great. Yeah. You kind of started talking a little bit about survivors, I guess, but who were the key players that sparked changes in funding and policy, and how did those partnerships, you mentioned the public-private partnerships, work?
Sure. So I mentioned Miss Ima, and she's obviously a very important figure. Comes back to Texas in the 1920s after seeking treatment outside the state, and she helps found a children's mental health clinic in Houston in 1929. The following year, her brother Will passes away kind of unexpectedly and leaves this multi-million-dollar endowment and a whole set of directives in his will for how that endowment could be spent. one of the options was to have a mental health foundation. And so she is going to then spend the next decade negotiating with UT Austin, of course, Will's alma mater, to have that foundation set up there and what was then known as the Hogg Foundation for Mental Hygiene. It was the first of its kind in that it was an entire philanthropic foundation devoted entirely to mental health, which really at that time, was unheard of. Funded by a family endowment, but housed at a public university. So in terms of a public-private partnership for its time, it was pretty unique. It opened in 1941. Miss Ima had to actually fight very hard, and I talk about some of the machinations that took place in the 1940s in the book, where she kind of had to battle with some members of the Board of Regents and some members of the UT administration to make sure that the foundation would be just devoted to mental health and not just become a sort of another department at the university. So that's kind of an interesting story. She had a couple of allies at UT to get this foundation off the ground who were also kind of key players at the time. One was the UT president, Homer Price Rainey, who was a supporter of developing the Mental Health Foundation. And Rainey brought one of his former students and mentees to the university to be the first director, and that was Robert Sutherland, who was a Chicago-trained sociologist at the fabled School of Sociology at the University of Chicago. Sutherland was an astute advocate for mental health, who paired the public educational work of the foundation with some very effective behind-the-scenes advocacy for the state to increase funding for mental health services in the hospitals and clinics. UT provided office space, provided management of the endowment, and appointed Sutherland to a faculty position. In fact, today there's an endowed faculty position that's named for Sutherland at the university. Lots of UT faculty from the various departments worked with the foundation, sometimes pro bono, sometimes for some kind of compensation as expert consultants and as public speakers. And Sutherland had a vast national network from his time at Chicago. He was also formerly the Dean of Students at Bucknell University, and he had directed a research program at the American Youth Commission in Washington, D.C., which was a project sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation. And this was all important because in the first 10 to 15 years of its existence, the foundation really operated on a shoestring budget. So, it didn't have vast resources in its early years. Its endowment would really start to grow significantly in the 50s. So they had to be very kind of clever with their resources, and they were pretty effective at that.
So how did both Texas politics and the national mental health concerns shape the work of the foundation?
Well, when Sutherland arrived at UT, he was really kind of confronted with politics, or Texas politics, pretty quickly because his mentor was fired. President Rainey was fired by the Board of Regents in a big sort of academic freedom struggle that's been well documented elsewhere. And then Sutherland was told that he couldn't be guaranteed that he would have a faculty position with tenure, and he almost left the university and left the foundation over it. But he persisted, and eventually both Miss Ima and Sutherland formed friendships and partnerships really with important elected and appointed state officials. At that time, there was a 3-person agency called the Board of Control that oversaw all of the state's institutions for dependent populations, which means all of the mental hospitals. And Sutherland formed good relationships with some of the members of that Board of Control. And so I've looked in their correspondence, and he's writing letters and memos back and forth with these people, showing them information about all the things they really needed to do. To me, this is behind the scenes advocacy, and you can see in the correspondence that they were sort of spending social time together, having drinks and going out to restaurants and things and talking about mental health in the mental hospitals. The foundation publicly was very careful to avoid any appearance of political lobbying or partisan activity. They also found an early ally in Governor Allen Shivers, who lobbied for increased mental health funding in 1949 and 50, even advocating for an increase in the oil tax to pay for improvements to the mental hospitals, which I found pretty incredible, given what we know about Texas politics and taxation. Shivers delivered an impassioned speech before a special legislative session in 1950 in which he insisted on increased funding for the mental hospitals. He laid out in graphic detail the dilapidated conditions in the hospitals. So there's really an interest, and there are other Texas governors and officials during this period who will take up the cause of mental health. John Connally will become a vocal advocate for mental health later. But the Cold War provides another important context for understanding the kind of intersection of politics and mental health, both nationally and in Texas. The Red Scare of the period inspired an anti-mental health movement, which I describe in the book, filled with a cast of colorful characters, including talk radio hosts and these sort of school board activists and some elected officials who alleged the existence of a conspiracy of mental health professionals to brainwash Americans into embracing communism. In one notable episode in 1959 in Houston, the school board in that city publicly burned the results of a survey given to area school children that just asked sort of attitude questions. It was a psychological survey, but there were questions about their students' views about civil rights, racial and ethnic minorities, as well as people with mental illness and people with disabilities. And so this was considered communistic, and there was a very sort of public, in front of reporters, burning of these survey results by the school board members. And the Hogg Foundation was sort of lumped in with these groups by some activists. Some Texas elected officials, both in Congress and the state legislature, attempted to promote legislation that would restrict the activities of tax-exempt foundations, and sort of argued that foundations themselves were these sort of unaccountable, shadowy organizations influencing American society. So, I mean, the foundation had to be very careful. They had a lot of success being located in Austin, obviously, and working with the legislature and some of the state agencies, but they also had to be careful because the winds could blow against them.
So what were some of the successes and failures for mental health during this period?
Well, I would start with the title of my book, Circuit Riders for Mental Health. That title referred to the thousands, I don't even know how many, of visits to local communities by the Hogg Foundation's experts and consultants, especially in about the first 15 years, the 1940s to about the mid-50s. Robert Sutherland himself, the executive director, reported giving 460 lectures in 56 different communities in just his first 3 years there. And so this idea that they were sort of crisscrossing the state and all 254 counties on these farm to market roads in their cars, sometimes hitting 2 or 3 different locations in a day to give talks about mental health. They spoke in high school gymnasiums and cafeterias and churches and community centers. They spoke in big cities. They spoke in unincorporated villages and small towns. They spoke to Anglo audiences. They spoke to Black audiences. They spoke to Mexican-American audiences. They began to refer to themselves as circuit riders, and that's where I got the title of the book. And I think they did bring a sort of religious sense of mission to their work. And as it happens, some of the founding faculty members who were involved, including Sutherland, were the children of ministers. So there is some connection there. In addition, when I say they talked about mental health, that sounds a little bit vague. what they often talked about were just sort of the everyday problems that families and communities were experiencing and how that reflected mental health issues and sort of common sense ways to deal with those problems. So it could be, how to deal with your children as they began to enter puberty, parent-child relations, sex and sexuality, infant and child care. And there's a section in the book where I describe this whole sort of baby care campaign that the foundations supported for low-income families, race relations. So they touched on these sort of hot button culture war issues, but in a way that kind of disarmed their audiences in a lot of cases. And so what I would suggest to you in terms of how this feeds into their biggest accomplishments, they not only educated the public about mental health and demystified it for them, I would argue they created a demand for publicly available mental health services outside of hospitals, right? And so later in the 1950s and 60s, when they began to really more openly advocate for those services, for clinics, for group homes and halfway houses and more individual practitioners in different places in the community, there's a demand there already in society because people understand what they're talking about now. And so in 1957, the foundation plays a significant role in the state of Texas adopting its first mental health code, which decriminalized mental illness. So prior to the passage of the mental health code, committing somebody to a mental hospital was a criminal proceeding that happened in a court with a jury, right? Which is incredibly stigmatizing, right? It could be for somebody who hasn't committed a crime, right? And Texas is one of the only states in the country that was still doing that by the 1950s. Most other states had already moved away from that. The Texas Mental Health Code did away with that and spelled out very elaborate commitment proceedings for different types of situations, almost all of which didn't involve a criminal court. They spelled out standards for treatment, standards for quality of care, standards for the use of restraints. So it was a major step forward at that time. In the following decade, in the mid-1960s, another sort of milestone was the passage of the Texas Mental Health and Mental Retardation Act of 1965, which was similar to laws that were being passed in a lot of states. That was funded by a federal Community Mental Health Act passed by the Kennedy administration just a couple of years earlier, that provided significant funding for the development of community clinics, community mental health clinics. And so the Texas law created the Texas Department of MHMR, which was the sort of standard state agency overseeing those activities in local communities until the late 90s when they disbanded it and started to really, the state started to deregulate mental health services. And in many ways, that law was sort of the culmination of one of the core points of the mental health movement going back to the early 1900s, which was the belief that most people with mental illness could be treated in the community and could live productive, dignified, normal lives with support services in the community, right? And so the Texas bill sort of was a culmination of that.
So that was a nice summation of years of work and a big success for the group and for mental health advocates generally. I guess we'll kind of circle back to more modern times here today.
Mm-hmm.
Seems like a fitting way to wrap it up here. Recently there have been calls to reprioritize public spending to combat inequality. Spending on mental health services is usually part of that discussion. How do you think the history you've written here can inform the decisions about mental health spending going forward?
Sure, and so there's really two ways I would approach that question. One of the through lines that kind of cuts through this entire historical narrative of the 20th century and mental health reform is the active role played by people like Ima Hogg or Clifford Beers, the people we would call consumers of mental health services. Those individuals were responding to a lack of access, but also a lack of good science. In decisions today about the shape of mental health services, policymakers and experts should listen to the people that they say they're trying to help, to consumers, individual consumers, as well as communities, especially historically underserved groups such as African American and Latinx peoples. The last chapter of the book talks about this somewhat ill-fated attempt to bring mental health services into the Texas Valley, into the Del Rio Valley. During the push to pass the MHMR Act in the mid-1960s, this huge committee, which the Hogg Foundation helped lead, did a survey of mental health services around the state of Texas to try and get a sense of where services were available and where they weren't available. And there was only one region in the entire state where they found exactly 0 mental health services, and it was the Valley, right? So in the 70s, the foundation attempts to go into the Valley and help promulgate some services. So what this means is that before that time, anybody in the Valley who wanted mental health services was probably going across the border to Mexico, or they were coming up to San Antonio to go to the San Antonio State Hospital, which neither is really an ideal solution. And the last chapter of the book talks about these sort of really struggled to set up a mental health clinic in Crystal City, right, which also happened to be the epicenter of the Chicano movement at that exact same time. So it's really quite a story. And the foundation actually published its own monograph about it. But it was really a struggle, I think, for them because they didn't always listen as well as they probably needed to. So I think in terms of what we can learn today, listening, all too often experts have assumed that they understood the needs of a particular population and didn't really need to consult with them, only to be proven wrong with varying levels of consequence. Many nonprofits and foundations today that provide mental health services or that engage in mental health advocacy or research include consumers on their advisory boards, which has allowed them to develop trainings for mental health professionals in something called cultural competency to ensure relevant services. So representation matters, and I mean that in terms of people with mental illness, consumers of services, as well as members of underrepresented groups. And so, you know, one of the trends in the academic programs has been intentionally involving diversity in the admission and promotion of students and the hiring of faculty, and that needs to continue. A second thing I discussed towards the end of the book that I think is relevant for our discussion today is what can happen when resources are yanked away abruptly from a major initiative. So with the latter part of the book, in talking about the community mental health movement and the spread of these community clinics and community-based services, one of the results of that was deinstitutionalizations. A lot of individuals that had been in hospitals now were being released from hospitals and sent back to the community with all kinds of supports ostensibly set up for them, funded at the federal and the state level. Then in the early 1980s, the Reagan administration came to office, and one of their priorities was to deregulate, to cut some of those services, and to convert a lot of those sort of very specific funds to block grants and give states more discretion. And so one of the results of that was a rise in homelessness and poverty amongst people with mental illness, because a lot of those services suddenly were yanked away right after they had been released from an institution. So to me, the lesson there is, if you're going to provide equity in mental health services, you have to ensure continuity of resource support. Don't create a set of unfunded or partly funded mandates, for example, upon which living, breathing people will have to depend, because that can have some really bad consequences. So those are a couple of things. I'm always hesitant about drawing too many direct line lessons from history. but I certainly think, we could be doing more. We could always be doing more in this area.
That's a great way to finish it, I think. Thanks so much for your insight and for talking to me today. Um, Everyone, please check out Circuit Riders for Mental Health if you haven't read the book already. There's a lot of great stories in there. We just heard a fraction of them today. And I want to thank you all for tuning in. If you want to find out more about what's going on at the Bullock Museum, you can always check out our website, www.thestoryoftexas.com, or you can visit our YouTube page for more programs like this. Thanks again, Dr. Bush.
Thank you. My pleasure.